Good morning, Megan.
Good morning, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm Dan Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com. And you are?
I am Megan McArdle. I'm the business and economics editor of The Atlantic, and I blog at meganmcardle.theatlantic.com.
And also, congratulations. You got married last month.
I did. Not even last month, actually, just 17 days ago.
Well, it was last month because now we're in July.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Okay, so I stand corrected.
You know, married life speeds by like that. You can just get used to
Well, apparently it mostly consists of going to Hawaii and lying on a beach, so I'm in favor.
So
that's true, right? It's just going to be like one long honeymoon?
Yeah, you know, it'll be like that. Yes, absolutely. You know, there's nothing but bliss in front of you. But that said, I feel bad because you invited me to your wedding, which was very kind of you. I couldn't make it, unfortunately, but I hear it was a lovely affair. The pictures looked fantastic, and of course, all I had to do was check my Twitter feed, and you know, was getting constant updates about the reception.
Yes, there was one person who Twittered, "I don't know anyone at this wedding, but I feel like I could do the seating chart." Because tables 6 and 7 were in the middle of a lengthy Twitter war during the reception.
And that's something everyone wants at their wedding, really.
Absolutely. I thought it was charming. There was some controversy in the blogosphere over whether the kids these days can't focus on anything. No one did Twitter during the wedding because we asked to turn cell phones off. So,
but you you had to ask, which I find that the fact that you even had to ask that is telling in and of itself.
Well, he actually just asked to turn cell phones off, which
okay.
Which I think is even the older generation has this issue. So
that's true. No, that's very true. So wait, I have to ask a question, which is, have you managed to call Peter, your husband, without having to mentally, consciously say that, or I mean, can you say
not yet? No.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's very strange. I keep going. My boyfriend, my husband.
My favorite.
How long does it take?
No. I remember when I was at. It was before I was married, and I was talking to a friend of mine who had just gotten married, and she couldn't say husband. All she could say was, "Yeah, the guy I'm married to." That was what she could say. So it requires some conscious. You'll eventually get used to it.
How long did it take you to get used to calling Erica your wife?
That was actually easier. I honestly, as banal as it sounds, it's because wife is one syllable, whereas husband is two. But it was pretty, I thought it was really cool. I'd be like, wife, one of the things we occasionally go back and forth with is, I don't know if you ever saw Priscilla, Queen of the Desert.
I didn't.
There is a lovely scene there where one of these few straight characters in the movie explains how he got married to this Vietnamese hooker, and basically they show it in flashback, and the Vietnamese hooker says, "I'm your wife now," and so we occasionally say that to each other. "You're my wife," and she says, "I'm your wife."
Aww.
Yeah, it's very sweet.
Yeah, so far we've had my favorite husband remark has been Peter. So I guess a fake Steve Jobs account Twittered confirming that the iPhone was coming to Verizon in 2011. So Peter very excitedly IM'd me this, and then immediately realized it was a parody Twitter account. And so he said, "Pay no attention to me. I am nothing but a source of bad information. I am the Research 2000 of husbands."
Oh, that's a good one-liner.
Yes,
he's
so
a keeper, Megan.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to haunt him with that line basically for the rest of his natural-born life.
That is like if he ever publishes a book, I can see in the blurb, Megan McArdle. Oh, he's the Research 2000 of
absolutely.
Right.
I want to blurb his book.
Well, I will say, I thought of you actually because I was on vacation this week with some friends, including a gay couple that had just recently gotten married. And they were exceptionally sweet. They were still in the cuddle phase. And the thing I kept thinking, it was the one moment where I actually thought, maybe there's something to this homosexual lifestyle, because I was walking into the TV room and they were all snuggled up, and looked like they were watching a really sweet movie. They were watching Aliens. Exactly. And I thought, you know what? That I get. That's something where, it's so nice that that's what they would think of as being the movie to cuddle and watch.
Well, I have to say that Peter is now sort of famous at his office because he apparently, I suggested he might want to bring the Xbox on the honeymoon in case it rained. And so he didn't hear.
You really suggested that?
I did. Well, I'd heard all these horror stories.
That wasn't a euphemism or anything. You actually meant Xbox.
No,
okay.
I actually suggested he might want to bring his video game console, just pack it and hook it up to the TV. I'd heard all these horror stories from people who were like, you think you want to go to an island and do nothing but stare into each other's eyes for 10 days. That is not true. Do not do it. By the end of the first week, you'll be at each other's throats, like playing activities. So I was like, hey, bring the Xbox. And I brought a video game that I bought for the honeymoon and for my Mac. And he bought a video game that he bought for the honeymoon, but apparently, like, the entire office was just realized that we were made for each other when he walked up to one of his colleagues and said, look what just arrived. It's my honeymoon video game. And she was like, you're bringing a video game? And he was like, yeah, no, Megan said I could bring the Xbox if I wanted.
Well, I mean, this might be a generational thing. You know, when I went on my honeymoon, we both did bring books. You know, the joke that Eric and I always have is that, you know, the only difference between us when we're working and when we're on vacation is it's a different set of books we're reading.
Basically, I read an awesome book about the Athenian Navy, actually, which I highly commend to everyone, called Lords of the Sea, which is, it talks about the Athenian Navy and sort of pegs it to the golden age of Athens, which is the appropriate thing to read while sitting in a hammock in Hawaii overlooking the ocean.
This is true. I'll tell you my book, you know, this is like the geekiest conversation ever. I brought, because we went to Italy, and so I brought Bob Putnam's Making Democracy Work, which was all about the sort of why the northern provinces in Italy had better civil society than the southern provinces.
Oh, we really are like the nerdiest people on the planet, aren't we?
Yes.
It's like,
okay, so
I'm not reading any books about the markets.
Okay, so I think we've now, you know, induced nausea among our commentators, but
if not to say stupor.
Yes, exactly. But this leads to an interesting segue, which is, you know, we also want to talk about the Dave Weigel business, and I believe many of the major players in this were all at your wedding.
Yes, I believe that. Well, the major player that we did, for those who don't know, Dave Weigel was a member of who is a friend and was at my wedding. But he's a member of a former email list discussion group called Journalist, and some of his emails, which were intemperate, it was a private off-the-record group, were leaked, and he ended up resigning from the Washington Post over this. And yes, many of the people on Journalist were at my wedding. Dave was at my wedding. The person we don't know and who I'm pretty sure wasn't at my wedding was the person who leaked them.
Right. Megan, can I ask you a question? Were you on Journalist?
No, okay. I am too far right to be on Journalist.
Right. Okay.
It is left of center and left, not or center. I mean, there are some, like Weigel is a little hard to pin down, but I am definitely not politically welcome.
Right. And what is your take on all of this?
You know, I think, like, here's the thing that I think a lot of people have had to learn. I'm actually going to blog about this today. There's the return of letters. Like, Victorian literature is replete with all of these plots about people trying to get their letters back. And they've written intemperate letters and so forth. And it's something that we've basically just forgotten about, right? Because and ended up, you know, with wiretapping and so forth, precisely because these conversations occurred over the phone or in person. But people in sort of 35 and under, especially bloggers, one thing I've noticed about bloggers, and I do not know if this is true of you because I've never asked, but in general, most of the bloggers I know hate talking on the phone. The first thing I do when I get on the phone is start thinking about my exit strategy. And it's not got to do with how much I like the other person on the phone. There's something about talking to someone I can't see.
First, let me say I'm flattered that you thought I was under 35. Second, yes, I like you. I've had a phone phobia for many, many years.
Right. So people don't, and especially now when people travel so much, the best way to reach me is email. In fact, I don't check my office phone. I don't even know how to check the voicemail on my office phone. And so, because partially just because it's so full of flacks calling me that the median message just doesn't get through. So I tell people, email me if you want to contact me. And so what Dave actually said to me is like, look, no one calls anymore. You do this stuff over email, you do it in writing. And I think that's a challenge that we're going to have to face, because the stuff he said, if he had written it in a column, I would be like, whoa, Dave.
Yeah.
That was totally, like, what's wrong with you? You are not a nice person. But it's the sort of thing that we've all said. Every journalist, I'm sorry to say this, like, I've said horrible things about Rush Limbaugh. I'm not exactly proud of this, but you get out of interviewing a source, they're running you around, or something strikes you. You have all this information that you can't use because it's off the record or what have you, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating to deal with.
This might be the other thing that bloggers all have in common, which is we can't stand it if we have good stuff, but we can't use it.
Yes.
Which is, in other words, let's face it, we're all kind of like scavengers in the sense that we want to publish something somewhere. We want to write something down for somewhere. And so if it can't go in like a traditional, column or scholarly paper or even a blog post, we'll find some kind of outlet. And that's one of the things that I think all the social media has done, which is, there are thoughts that I have which, are not worthy of a scholarly article, so maybe it's a blog post. If it's not a blog post, maybe it's a tweet. And if it's or if it's a thought that I really don't want public, maybe I'll do it on Facebook. Although apparently, who knows if that really counts at this point.
No, I think that people do this. We all do this. Unless you are like some sort of Catholic saint, you come home and say mean things about people you've met, and it's not necessarily like the proudest human trait, but we do because that's how people gossip. Yeah. And essentially what he did was say the kind of thing that had you heard him say it at 3 a.m. in a bar, you'd have been like, oh, Dave, that's funny, whatever. And some of it really was. I mean, I think the line about Matt Drudge dealing with his emotional problems in a more responsible way by, say, setting himself on fire, whether or not you like Matt Drudge, that was a funny line.
I have to admit, that was a bit of an overreaction. I mean, I read the line, and I was like, well, clearly this was meant to be a joke. It's not like he really wants to do this.
Right. I mean, people actually treated it like he was advocating that Matt Drudge should actually set himself on fire, which is ridiculous. I've said funny things like that about my friends, much less to their face. I'm not. So he was making jokes. He got blown.
And I haven't forgotten it, Megan.
I still remember the time when you sat there and were like, Megan McArdle, anti-Semite. So,
that, by the way, if you ever write that book, Megan, I will be happy to blurb it that way. Megan McArdle, beyond her rampant anti-Semitism, is an awesome writer.
Yes. So you joke with people, whatever, and so some of it probably shouldn't have said. I hope Rush Limbaugh doesn't make it out of the hospital. I'm pretty sure that I've said something that mean about a public figure I didn't like at some point. Shouldn't have. I would like to be a more saintly person than I am. But he was basically blowing off steam, and the problem is that now when we blow off steam, we're frequently writing it down.
Well, I was going to say,
we don't have norms for that.
Isn't the problem? Journalists have been doing this, as you point out, ever since there have been journalists. The difference now is that, unfortunately, it's this tendency combined with the fact that you can write it down somewhere for potentially your friends or others to read, and there are times where maybe you shouldn't do that, or maybe you think you're doing it in a private manner, as Weigel did, but it turns out it wasn't so private.
I live in terror that my email boxes will be, someone will hack my email account, not because I've confessed to any super secret conspiracy or what have you, but just because God knows what I've said about public figures jokingly or in frustration or whatever, and none of it means that I'm any less objective than any other journalist who's available. It's just that, people, you just say things you don't mean. This is it's part of sort of social interaction. Yeah. I don't think there's anyone on the planet who can say, under the age of 40, who can say, yes, I would be happy to have every single IM conversation and email I've ever sent be made public.
Let me once again add that I'm grateful you think I'm under the age of 40. But yes, I take your point. Although, I would add this. There's been I guess I have a question for you. I've never met Weigel to my knowledge, and I haven't really interacted with him. But this was sort of one of these things that lit up my Twitter feed because everyone I knew him. And there was a sense in which this almost felt like a high school thing where there was some clique that broke up, but it went all over big blogs and media sites and so forth. And there was an aspect to which I kind of thought this was overblown. Everyone talked about how Weigel's career was ruined, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. He's at MSNBC now, right?
Well, he's got a part-time. It's not a full-time thing, but yeah, he's got a part-time gig as a commentator. Weigel's going to be fine.
Right.
His career is going to be fine. People are already swooping in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think I have no problem talking about the norm about whether or not these things should be publicized, but there was a way in which I got a sense that like the human tragedy was being a bit exaggerated. I mean, I don't mean to diminish what Weigel's had to go through, but I've gotten fired from jobs too, and it's not great, but if you've got talent, you just sort of dust yourself off and move on, which it sounds like Weigel is doing. And
as I recall, you had a rather public dispute over your tenure at the University of Chicago.
Some things happen.
But I mean, like, it isn't fun, and it's not fun to do it in the public eye. And people did get. I was among those who was outraged for you. There is a high school aspect to DC, and I think there have been a lot of people sort of expressing disgust about this. But the fact is, it's like anything else. I remember one of my professors actually telling me when I was thinking about did I want to apply to grad school, and he was like, "Do you remember high school? Now imagine if everyone you went to high school with kind of had a PhD." Like all the infighting and the the cliques and so forth. No, and that at least was his description of an academic department as well. Right,
and I think it might be safe to say that this sort of thing does happen in all the various subcultures of I don't know offices offices or professions or what have you. The difference might be in this case is that since it's a media thing, everyone else gets to read it as well.
Right,
and not just everyone else gets to read it. Everyone else might actually be interested in it.
But I mean, there's a sense in which, right, like, there's a reason that most adults don't watch high school movies, and like maybe we all it's our friend who this happened to, and also was done by someone who probably a journalist, and therefore knows about the canons of violating an off-the-record conversation is one of, like, short of plagiarism or faking a story, about the most serious thing you can do as a journalist. And so someone who knew the norms, who's one of us, and who broke them. So that was an aspect that was kind of underexplored because people were, like, directly outraged for Weigel. But the fact that happened, the person who, if the person, they find out who leaked it, that person should never work in journalism again. And there will be a lot of pressure, at least among his friends, to make sure that person doesn't. Or if they are not in journalism and a source, to make sure that they're never ever contacted by a journalist again. But
that won't happen. I mean, come on, let's be realistic. If it turns out that it was a source, I mean, sources leak all the time. I understand the violation. I mean, I can understand if the person was socially shunned, but if that person is a valuable source, and it turns out they did this, I mean, you're right. You're going to be cautious, but journalists aren't going to boycott a source, are they?
It would depend. If it was like a minor think tank person, sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right? Like, because they get from us often more than we get from them.
Right, no, they need you a lot more than you need them frequently, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that person would have a very hard time getting interviewed by anyone who is, like, connected with this, because violating off the record is really serious. And it has to be punished. If it's not punished, then you end up with a system in which it's very hard to get information.
Well, speaking of which, I mean, this is a detour, and I'm not entirely sure about the details here, but wasn't there a similar controversy about whether or not the Rolling Stone reporter violated off-the-record rules on the McArdle story?
Yes, and one of the funniest tweets about Dave was, like, I know who should replace Dave Weigel at the Post, David Petraeus. But I haven't read the story yet because I was actually on a news fast on my honeymoon. This was like...
Oh, good for you.
Well, given that the two of us, I mean, we not only are both journalists, we both write about a lot of the same stuff. Like, we're not going to talk about... The last night of our honeymoon we talked about work, and then we caught ourselves. Yeah. And we stopped. So I actually never read the article. It's still in my enormous queue of things that I did not read in the 2.5 weeks that I was doing other things. So I actually don't know, like, I haven't followed this as closely as I want to. My understanding is that, yes, now McArdle and the aides are saying this was not part of the on-the-record discussion, and he was told that. Now, he says he has recordings, which should probably clear that up. Yeah, but they would have to run basically continuously for that to be the case. What's your take on that?
I mean, my take is, as I said, I have a lack of information here because I know the accusation was made. I'm not entirely sure if that's true or not. But that said, it sounds to me like, let me put it this way, if I have to bet what happened, the Rolling Stone reporter burned his sources, or the sources, might have thought something was off the record, but actually they never were explicit about it, and they just shot their yaps off, I'm probably going to take the latter as the more likely outcome.
I think I assume that that's probably true for a couple of reasons. The first is that I am often astonished by the dumb things people will say off the record. On the record, rather. Where, like, I'm talking to them, and you're like, I made it clear that I'm a reporter, right? I'm going to write this down, and then I'm going to print it where other people can read it. Like, right. Have you forgotten that in between when we started this conversation? And so people do. They forget. They get caught up, or they... The second is that, as you say, it's a really very serious thing. People have done it. It's not that it's never happened, but it's pretty serious, and if proven out, would make it hard for this guy ever to work again, basically.
Right. Well, this raises an interesting question. I don't know if you were back by the time that David Brooks wrote that op-ed. I think it was last week.
I was, yes.
Right. This raises an interesting question, which is, at what point, when you are a reporter and you're dealing with someone, and to some extent, either off the record or even potentially on the record, as you said, doing the sort of standard bitching that people do. At what point do you say, you know what, this is... And it's almost the relationship between reporters and sources. When do you realize, you know what, I know that I could make news with this, but it would also be... It would create a misperception about what's actually going on. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, Matt Steinglass, who's a reporter in Vietnam, actually wrote a really good piece on this where he talked about doing this with activists. And he said,
right, yeah.
Some of the activists that I interview clearly understand what they're doing. They're professionals. They've made a really rational decision to do this.
Right.
And I'm helping them advance their cause. But some of the people I interview have had something bad happen to them, and they're just angry and they're not thinking straight.
Right.
And if I run an interview with this person, I am basically aiding them in ill-considered self-destruction. It may be news, but do I do that? And that's, like, there's this tension here. I think that Clive Crook, I'd actually be interested. Clive Crook of my publication in the Financial Times argued that, in fact, the revelations didn't really advance the story that much. They were news. They got a general fired, but they didn't actually tell you... As you said, like, are we really surprised that the people who are subordinate to Obama sometimes don't like him and make jokes about him? Like, did it, you read the article, did it really advance our understanding of what's happening in Afghanistan, or was it just, like, was it a coup for the journalists without necessarily providing necessary new information?
Let me put it this way. I would say, in some ways that story was really two separate stories. The first one, the second one, which he clearly wanted to be the more substantive one, was about whether or not counterinsurgency was actually working in Afghanistan. And that was the part where I actually thought the story was a bit slanted against McArdle, pointing... I think he was raising questions about coin activists that I'm not entirely sure were accurate. That said, the story that I did find interesting was the extent to which bureaucratic politics and personal rivalries were in some ways plaguing the Afghanistan story. Now, this might be a function in part that I wasn't paying that much attention to it last year as the strategy was being formulated. But I will say that if nothing else, the story did do a good job of sort of crystallizing and making it clear that these things haven't gone away and that they're a big, serious problem. And then on the one hand, these were just staff guys bitching a lot. But on the other hand, McArdle got caught, saying something about Holbrooke, which you generally shouldn't say, about a fellow policy principal, particularly when a reporter is standing around. So I do think let me put it this way, I think there was new information contained in there. And in some ways it was the best kind of reporting because it was new information that wasn't just said, it was revealed through action and statement. And that's what good reporting should do. So in that sense, I do think there was something that was advanced by it.
Well, in that case, I think in this case, like, you break the story. Yeah. You at that point. But there is, and the other reason I find this plausible, and I think that, in fact, they may not have understood what was happening, is that longtime journalists protect their sources a lot.
Right.
Right, and that's how you get intimate with these guys, is that you protect them. This journalist didn't do it, but I think that they had gotten an expectation from the sort of more long-time war correspondents that that's what was going to happen.
Right, because any Rolling Stone reporter is automatically going to... this is where I think the fact that he's from Rolling Stone. And again, it's not I'm casting aspersions on Rolling Stone. I just never think of that publication as being terribly friendly to the military.
It was not wise. It was really, on many levels, not a wise thing to do. But I think that there's always going to be a tension for journalists between developing relationships with your sources and being compromised. And there's no perfect line that you can say where okay, here I'm lucky in a way because my sources I rarely use from time to time because I write stories about something different every month. Yeah. So I'm not in the position of needing to say nice things about this CEO so that when I write about him in 2 weeks, I'll still be able to chat with him. Once I've written about QVC, that's pretty much it. I'm never going to write about it again. But most journalists don't have that luxury, which means that they have to maintain some sort of relationship because otherwise you're just in the position of being an outside observer. And I should say, Ernie Pyle, for example, did amazing war reporting that way. Right. But it's tricky. It's always going to be tricky. But I think that probably the Rolling Stone reporter did the right thing. I mean, the interesting question that I have for you is, what does this mean for Afghanistan? Is it going to make us less effective there, or?
Let me put it this way. I think you can argue that what Obama's decision to replace McChrystal with Petraeus was probably the best. It was the best of what was going to be a bad situation. I mean, I would argue, I think there was a story in the Times today, actually. I mean, my argument would have been you would have gone for the clean sweep, because it's not just McChrystal who's behaved badly there. You also have Eikenberry, who's the ambassador, and Richard Holbrooke, who's Richard Holbrooke. And so it might have actually been, in some ways, I would have replaced all three of them. But that's tough to do in a 24-hour window, so it'll be interesting to see going forward whether the civilian side also gets, bulked up. And that was one of the arguments, and I think that came out of the Rolling Stone story, the point that, in Iraq, for example, you had Petraeus, but you also had Ryan Crocker on the civilian side, and the two of them worked very closely together. You don't have that in Afghanistan, in part because the suggestion was McChrystal picked a British diplomat, and as a result, that sort of automatically underweighted the civilian side of things. I think the other thing is that Obama, in his statement talked about, the main goal now being to reverse the Taliban's momentum, which is about as modest a goal as you can probably get. We're no longer talking about Afghan democracy. We're talking about stabilizing the situation enough so you could probably withdraw or retrench as quickly as possible. And I got to say, I don't have a problem with that. I was struck by, I don't know if you saw over the weekend, Leon Panetta, did this interview with This Week saying, there may be 60 to 100 al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan. And let's face it, we were there initially because of al-Qaeda. We obviously don't want it to become a haven for al-Qaeda again, but I'm not entirely sure that would be the case anyway at this point. So maybe we should reallocate our resources a little bit and get the hell out.
It's a hard thing, I think, though. I mean, to be the guy, right, who decides to abandon
be the guy who decides
to Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, in some ways, this is what I think Obama is. This is my take on this. Americans retreat by first going forward. This is what happened in Somalia when, right after the Black Hawk Down incident, the response was, we're going to bulk up, U.S. forces in Somalia for 6 months, and then we're going to pull down. You can argue the surge in Iraq was a similar sort of thing, where we're going to bulk up with the idea that eventually we're getting the hell out. I really do think you're seeing the same thing take place in Afghanistan. So, the way that Americans retreat is by first trying to at least stabilize the situation to the point where, A, you can retreat with some dignity, and B, you don't damage your reputation as being someone who, withdraws immediately in the face of difficulty. But you're right, politically it's very hard for this it's a very difficult act to pull off.
So speaking of politics and defense and intelligence, the Russian spies. I think you had the best quote about this. This was the most bizarre thing since most bizarre intelligence incident since the Sandy Berger "I'm going to stuff classified documents down my pants" move. Yes,
anytime I can bring up Sandy Berger stuffing down his pants, I try to do that. I am now becoming marginally convinced that this entire thing is a put up by Hollywood to promote that new Angelina Jolie movie.
Well, they are relying increasingly on product tie-ins in order to make their money, so...
I like that. This espionage ring was brought to you by Salt. I can tell you one thing, Angelina Jolie would be a much better spy than, the New York Madam or whatever her name is.
Well, there was that one girl who was kind of a pretty club girl, right?
Right, yeah. That seems quite... that's clearly, the tabloids in New York are clearly having a field day with this, calling her the, Moscow bombshell or whatever. I think I have two substantive takes. Because, one of the things, what seems clear now is that first, these people actually were guilty of something. The Russians have copped to the fact that these were Russians. But that said, this is... On the one hand, I guess I feel good because it turns out the FBI actually was able to figure out what all these people were doing. At the same time, this reads like a pre-internet plot, and it didn't occur to any of these people of, oh, you mean we could gather the information we were trying to gather through sidling up to powerful people just by reading the internet? Really? We can do that?
As I said, it sort of reminds me of, this is a possibly apocryphal story, but I have heard from multiple sources that during for a long time, during the 60s and 70s, that some Russian intelligence agency had subscribed to the Village Voice in an attempt
to get a view of American rural life.
Yes, data on American rural life. And
I think that was the Institute for USA and Canada Studies. I think they actually...
yes. And it took them 10 years or something to notice that they weren't... That most of the activity described in the Village Voice was the sort of thing that doesn't happen in rural areas because it tends to frighten the cows. It was it's something like that. It's what were they thinking? I
don't know what... you're right. Part of it is that there is a mindset... And, this has come out in a few op-eds that have pointed out that the Russians really think... There was a great anecdote in Hedrick Smith's book, The Russians, where Brezhnev took did the sort of tour of the United States, and they had just visited Disneyland and all these other things, and, Nixon wanted them to, fly over the country to see the U.S. industrial might. And it was clear that that Brezhnev actually thought that the only way the U.S. could really be this productive was because there was some secret cabal actually running the economy, like a centrally planned structure. And so, you do wonder if that kind of mindset would explain this, the belief that, in fact, there are, in the deep, dark corridors somewhere between D.C. and New York, there are a few people that really, really do, are so powerful that they actually explain. They're almost like cigarette smoking man, Cancer Man in the X-Files. They decide, when the economy goes up, when the economy goes down, who's going to win the Super Bowl, those kinds of things.
Well, allegedly, Vladimir Putin actually said to Bush he visited shortly after Rothergate and said something like, "You see, you do control the media. Look, you've taken." It was actually there was an anecdote that someone posted in my blog comments about the North Vietnamese, where he said. It was from a memoir written by a Vietnamese guy who said early on one of his jobs was translating papers, English language papers, for the North Vietnamese leadership, and that it quickly occurred to him with total horror that they had no mechanism for understanding how the U.S. press worked, and so he had to spend all of this time futilely trying to explain to them that what the New York Review of Books said probably wasn't going to have a lot of influence on U.S. foreign policy. Because they would be it's in the New York Review of Books, clearly something's going to happen. And he would be no one in the administration reads this. And, but because they didn't understand the idea of a free press, if it was being written there, they thought that must have some sort of policy implication.
Right.
And so, I think that there is, in some way, perhaps, just an inability to understand, you didn't need to have any of this. Forget the internet. They could have just found some interns at think tanks who are making no money.
I was saying, God knows they could have used the money, yeah.
Right, and gotten more information had they just offered each of them like $100,000 to talk about whatever they'd heard at the...
Screw $100,000. These are interns. You could have offered them probably $10,000 and a free lunch, and they would have done it.
Oh, yeah, lunch, coffee, and a Danish.
Yeah, there you go.
And it just... that there was like this massive overkill. It's like when the Nazi spies were landed on American shores. One of the hilarious things is that, I mean, not that hilarious, but, there were these 11 Nazi spies who managed to make it to the United States, and apparently they had these elaborate plans for getting hold of guns that involved, like, staging raids on, and then one of their U.S. contacts was like, I don't understand, why don't you just go to the store and buy one? Wouldn't that be a lot easier than knocking over an armory? And that they were totally, and I think that I'm sure that there are aspects of that with the Soviet Union too, that we over-elaborate our secret plans because we just somehow cognitively are not able to appreciate the finer points of Soviet life, or Russian life now.
Well, I mean, I would say the following. First of all, I mean, in some ways, yeah, I mean, there's almost something vaguely pathetic about the spy ring. I mean, there was the published, transcript of, one of the spies actually, befriending a major Democratic contributor. And the Moscow Center, which is straight out of a Jean Le Carré novel, I might add, Moscow Center saying, this is wonderful, tell us what they think about the U.S. Iran policy and machinations in the White House and so on, I mean, they're really excited because, something, they think this is a real fight. And in some ways, it's just so pathetic that they think that. It's really telling.
What you really want to know is what they think of the future of car sales at their Chevy dealership, because that's probably going to give you more useful information about the U.S. economy and policy than the fact that they managed to donate a lot of money. Yeah, that's so. It's been an interesting, I think, window. I mean, it's almost like we have a little spy ring on Moscow intelligence to understand how they think about us.
I mean, I would say two other things. The second thing is that in some ways this really refutes a lot of realists in the United States, or realists more generally, are always convinced that democracy undercuts the ability to practice foreign policy. And the argument they make is it undercuts our foreign policy because we're so transparent. Anyone from the outside can see what's going on, and we'll know what our intentions and what our strategies are likely to be. And therefore we're at a disadvantage compared to more opaque authoritarian states. And I think if nothing else, this episode suggests that's just flat out wrong. That there is a difference between being transparent and being understandable to others, and that there are biases that others have coming into trying to analyze our country. And this isn't unique to Moscow. I mean, Moscow. This might be the most cartoonish version of it, but in some ways, I think intelligence analysts in China suffer from the same problem, which is they kind of overassume coherence in the United States when it actually doesn't exist. And this is. Actually, I think Walter Russell Mead made this argument in his book Special Providence, that this is the unique American advantage, which is we are not necessarily, we're often a mess, and as a result, this completely puzzles our adversaries.
There's a great line from, I can't remember who it was, someone at the UN, who said, you Americans never make simple, stupid moves. You only make complicated, stupid moves that make the rest of us wonder if we aren't missing something.
Exactly. No, that's a fair point. I think that's a fair point. I suppose the third thing, and in some ways this is the most significant aspect of this, is that it doesn't appear that this is going to affect in any way the sort of broader Russian-American relationship. That while this is going to garner a lot of tabloid headlines, in the end, the Russians are not, the Russians do not seem terribly exercised about that. I mean, they got upset for about a day, but now they're toning it down. Obama said this isn't going to really change the relationship that much. If anything, it might mildly help the United States in that it probably, you assume that whoever set up this spy ring was probably closer to Putin than Medvedev, and Medvedev is the guy that Obama clearly wants to do business with.
Right. So I think it's and from my point of view, it's just basically hilarity because I don't write about foreign policy. I'm just totally. It reminds me of all of these awesome '80s spy novels. So I just observe it. One of the questions though is was it worth charging these guys?
Well, I actually do. I mean, the one thing that raised my eyebrows was the timing of all this, because it came right after a surprisingly successful visit by Medvedev. I mean, bear in mind they were not charged with espionage. They were charged with being unregistered foreign agents in the United States, which at most gets them 5 years. So this isn't a serious charge, and I think they did it because apparently they were worried they were going to leave the country. I guess the question you could ask is, even if they left the country, so what? Because they hadn't done anything really successful. You potentially could have let them go, and it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. I say in that sense, I mean, I understand why the FBI wanted to charge them. I mean, in some ways, this was an example of bureaucratic politics on both sides, where you've got the Russian intelligence service desperately trying to justify, yes, this is yielding huge results for us, when in fact it wasn't yielding huge results of any kind. And then in some ways, this is a coup for the FBI. They can say, see, we brought down this, massive Russian ring, which was, as I said, the lamest ring ever. But, it allows the FBI to look relatively smart. I mean, I suppose in some ways it makes sense to bust them just to sort of point out to the Russians, by the way, we knew this was going on. I do like, someone suggested, someone suggested, you were talking about 80s spy novels. This to me is like 80s spies movies, and someone suggested to me that this is actually like Spies Like Us. Oh, yeah. Which is a bad Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd movie, but the premise of it was that there was a very, very secret mission that was being planned in the Soviet Union, and so as a decoy, they decided to take two schleps, played by Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd, and make them super spies as well, with the idea that they would get caught, allowing the real spies to do their work.
I remember this. Yeah. Maybe it's just a lot of misdirection, and there's still a giant spy ring out there that's actually making contact with Republican donors, who, as we know, are much more important than Democratic donors, and control the
making contact with Angelina Jolie, who's also more powerful in some ways.
So what else were we going to talk about on this?
I think our last topic was do we stimulus or retrenchment? I know you have a fair amount of thoughts about this, but
yes. Well, I mean, you lead off. What have you been thinking? I mean, there was this article on the on Ireland in the New York Times, which has generated an enormous amount of controversy. You've got on the one hand left. It breaks down pretty consistently. The left wing is like, see. It was actually a surprising article to me just because it was written with a very clear point of view on whether stimulus works or not, which is not all that normal for news articles. But so the left is like, see, it proves we shouldn't do austerity, and then the right is like, well, the reporter kind of clearly stacked the deck. Yeah. Which I would say is true. I mean, she interviews Ken Rogoff and then just kind of ignores what he says, which is, given that this guy was the chief economist at the IMF and has just written basically the definitive book on financial crises, giving him one sentence and then not picking up on it is a little strange.
Well, I mean, this also comes on the heels of the G20 summit in Toronto, in which it was clear that despite Obama's efforts to try to get other countries to engage in similar kinds of stimulus spending, it's not quite happening. Germany and the rest of the European Union are now obsessed with austerity, including David Cameron in the UK. And I mean, my take on this is that, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm more sympathetic to the stimulus arguments than I suspect you are, in the sense of, I mean, I really do think, you become a bit of a Keynesian when you're in a scenario such as now, where in fact global growth is so slow and the economy is so slack, where, there are times where, stimulus can go forward and actually accomplish something. I would like to see that married to some kind of effort to actually indicate from the United States that they recognize there's a long-term fiscal train wreck coming and that there are ways to deal with it. I actually was reading an article in the New Republic today, that made the case of, things are fine and, the economy is surging and, there's a long-term deficit problem, but all we have to do is raise taxes and cut spending. And that's just so simple. And, it's like the argument, the only way you have to lose weight is just to, eat less and exercise, which is to say, we all know that, but the political ways in which you can accomplish that are really, really hard. Right. But the other thing that I wonder about is whether or not there's a danger in terms of overgeneralizing the U.S. situation, from others to the U.S. situation. I mean, the Reinhardt and Rogoff book, which you talk about, does this. And then there's this, concern that Paul Krugman and others and David Leonhardt have talked about, which is whether this is 1937 all again. And Tyler Cowen raises the point, well, that's only the case if you ignore monetary policy, and monetary policy has been, unbelievably loose. But in addition to that, there's part of which, I guess I wonder whether the crunches that other countries face because of, increasing debt loads applies with equal force to the United States because, A, we have the reserve currency, and B, we're the natural safe haven when times are tough.
Well, I think I'm actually a stimulus agnostic. I really am. I think that, I understand the macroeconomic theory behind it. I would have tried it. I would have voted for a stimulus bill. But I don't know how strong the empirical evidence that it works. And also, I don't think it works equally at all points in the debt curve and all points in the economic rate. It's going to work with varying effectiveness depending on a bunch of different variables to the extent that it works at all. And so I think, to me, the problem with that article about Ireland, because it seemed to me like it was pretty clearly aimed at saying, why, warning U.S., don't go down this path.
Don't become Ireland, right.
Is a couple things. First of all, Ireland's economy, it's really not very comparable to the United States. It's a really small, extremely open economy where exports and imports are this just implausibly large, for various reasons, portion of its gross domestic, its gross national product, rather. And it's just different. It's so different in so many ways that it's hard to say, this has a whole lot of bearing on the United States. That said, Ireland, it's not clear to me that Ireland had the choice of running, say, a 25% of GDP deficit.
Right.
And so, there wasn't, but it's also not clear to me that we do. And I think that at this point, we're kind of in a game of chicken with our bond market, right?
Yeah.
Most of the debt that we borrowed to finance the stimulus spending is short-term debt.
Right. But that said, short-term interest rates are pretty damn low right now.
They are, but the problem is it's all got to be rolled over. And so the minute, the difference between borrowing this, say, on 30 years is that the minute that the bond markets start worrying, which they haven't yet, right, we're suddenly in big trouble because we have to roll over just gigantic sums of very low interest rate debt. And if the interest rate jumps, say, 4 percentage points, it's going to have a really ugly impact on our budget.
Oh, no, that I completely agree with. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that, the argument that it is true, the bond market is showing no signs of worrying, and that's a valid argument, but it's also true that for all of these people who are in trouble, the bond market was showing no signs of worrying right up to the point where it showed signs of worrying. And that was when they started into a bad debt crisis spiral. I think the U.S. has a lot more run room than any other country in the world on this front. But
I think I would say that's the one thing that I find isn't talked about enough in terms of sort of the global, in other words, there's attempts to say, well, look at Europe, that's going to happen to us, which it isn't entirely possible if, current trends were to persist for quite some time. But there are ways in which the U.S. is different. But go on.
Well, I think that the problem is that, like so much in economics, in some sense, this is recursive. The United States has more run room because the United States doesn't abuse its run room. If the United States abused its run room, we wouldn't have the run room, and we would be in trouble. And so, we have to be credible that we're going to fix this. And the reason, basically, right now, the bond market is just assuming we're going to fix it. At the point at which there's any question of that, interest rates are going to start going up. And I don't think we know when that is. And I think that it is negligent to simply say we can borrow money cheaply. That's the end of the story. It is part of the story, and that's important. But I do think that people like Paul Krugman and so forth, and let's be honest on both sides. I'm basically libertarian. Paul Krugman is very liberal, and we both have priors about how much government spending we want. And a lot of this argument about stimulus, it's crap. It's a proxy for how much spending do we want the government to do. And a lot of the people who are in favor of stimulus are hoping that level of spending will become permanent. And a lot of the people who are against stimulus are afraid that a lot of that spending will become permanent. And that's really what this is all about. No one, I have said this multiple times now, do I care about this year's deficit or next year's deficit? No. We absolutely can borrow this level of money and nothing bad will happen. Very little bad will happen. Like, so the scale of bad will not be measurable in the context of the U.S. economy. But I do worry, first of all, that some of this spending will become permanent, which is going to make doing a lot of other things that we have to do harder. But I also think I'm worried by the fact that we really, at this point, don't have any credible path to get the spending down. Because as soon as these deficits expire, we then have to start dealing with Social Security and Medicare, which are becoming a huge problem in the mid to late part of this decade. And so how much room are we leaving ourselves to deal with that? What we're doing now is making that task harder. I think that is true and worrisome.
Right. I think the thing that surprises me, this is, I'm not normally one who sort of laments, rising partisanship in the Beltway is making life difficult, because I was 99 times out of the time I find that argument complete horseshit. But I do wonder whether this is in some ways the kind of problem that is tailor-made genuinely for a commission, that would sort of propose solutions that requires pain and sacrifice on both sides of the aisle, which is, let's face it, the only way, that New Republic article was right, which is the only way you're going to get any kind of, large-scale correction on this is you're going to have to cut entitlement spendings a little bit. You're probably going to have to increase the retirement age on Social Security. You're going to have to reduce the COLA increases on Social Security. Oh, and by the way, Republicans, you're going to have to raise taxes, because they can't only come from the spending side. And you're probably going to have to cut defense spending a fair amount. Now, if you do all that, you would actually probably have something that approximates a solution. And in some ways, the one thing politicians love to do is to make promises that you don't have to worry about for at least 5 years. So it strikes me there's a way in which you could do this that would actually reassure a lot of people that, yes, there's a long-term plan to deal with this, but actually doesn't require any immediate measures right now. And I kind of wonder why that hasn't gone forward yet. And again, the only answer I've got is partisanship.
Well, I think that, when I look back at the history of commissions succeed when both sides want them to, right? Yeah. Like with the base closing commission, right? Like everyone knew what had to happen, and they weren't even opposed to it. They just needed the political cover. No one in Alabama could vote to close a base in Alabama, et cetera. Right. And given that, you weren't going to be able to get any of this through unless you had a commission. Yeah. And the Greenspan Commission, people forget, when the Greenspan Commission was acting, Social Security was literally, I think, a couple months away from not sending any checks. So it was a different situation. It was a crisis. Everyone recognized that something had to happen. And I think the difference now is that the choices are a lot bigger than they were back then. The problem is bigger. There's less room. Every time, I've been saying this a lot now, is that people forget, we tend to think of new spending or new taxes as a percentage of the existing level. And so to us, doubling a tax rate from 5 to 10% sounds like a larger increase than from 50 to 55%. Yeah. But in fact, that doubling is only a 5%, a little more than a 5% decrease in your take-home income when it's from 5 to 10%. It's a 10% reduction in your take-home income when it's from 50 to 55%. Every spending program, every tax leaves you less room because there's so much less, because you have to take a bigger chunk of what's left outside the government sector every time you do something new. And so I think that we have less room. The amount that we need to take is bigger. And there's no consensus, right? Democrats are still basically stuck on not doing anything serious to Social Security and not making any changes to Medicare and not doing any serious spending cuts. And Republicans are still basically stuck on doing virtually all of it on the spending side. And there's no bipartisan commitment at all. I don't know that it's because we're more partisan than we are. I think in part it's because it's still 5 years away. There's a bunch of sort of because there's an election coming up right now in which one party is poised to win big and the other party is poised to lose big. I think there's a lot of stuff going on, but I don't think the commission, ultimately with the Greenspan Commission, what happened was that the Senate made a deal and the House made a deal. It wasn't that they just adopted this. They told the Greenspan Commission what they were going to do, and the Greens, at least as I understand it. Yep.
Sorry, you warned that your microphone might be going out. It's starting to do weird things, or in terms of sounding.
Unless you're.
Unless you're turning into a Terminator or something, I can barely hear you out. Let me close, and then we can end this. I mean, I think that's a fair. I think that's a fair characterization of what's going on. I have a colleague at UCLA, Amy Ziegert, who's done interesting work on presidential commissions, and the depressing thing is that in most cases, presidential commissions are actually not, recommendations are not implemented. And I think you're right. I mean, the only way this happens is if you actually have key players in Congress decide, literally, fuck it. You know what? We're in too big of a situation to care about what the next electoral cycle is going to be or whether or not it pleases this interest group. We actually have to make the grand bargain, kind of like what happened with the 86 tax reform, or as you said, the 83 Social Security episode. And it'll be interesting to see, and this is what our political system occasionally does not do terribly well, is not so much the crisis problem, but rather, as you say, the situation where a crisis is coming, but you could probably go as the status quo can persist for at least 5 or 10 years, and no one's really going to suffer that much. And so I agree with you. That's unfortunately where we really suck as a system of government, and it would be nice to see that improved somehow. But I don't have any brilliant recommendations on how to do that.
And on that note, apparently in a Terminator voice...
oh, wait, okay, now you're sounding better. That's good. But that was freaky, I got to tell you.
Well, I am part robot, as many of my critics have pointed out.
Well, that gives the whole Peter brings the Xbox to the vacation a whole new level that I'm not even going to get into. But
robots are people too, Dan. Anyway, I will. Since I'm having microphone problems, I guess we'll cut this a little bit short and say, as always, Dan, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and farewell, Internet.
Megan, it's been a pleasure, and once again, warm and hearty congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye, Internet.
Bye.
There was some controversy in the blogosphere over whether the kids these days can't focus on anything. No one did Twitter during the wedding because we asked to turn cell phones off. So,
but you you had to ask, which I find that the fact that you even had to ask that is telling in and of itself.
Well, he actually just asked to turn cell phones off, which I think is even the older generation has this issue. So
that's true. No, that's very true. So wait, I have to ask a question, which is. Have you managed to call Peter, your husband, without having to mentally, consciously say that? Or can you say
not yet? No.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's very strange. I keep going. My boyfriend, my husband.
My favorite.
How long does it take?
No. I remember when I was at. It was before I was married, and I was talking to a friend of mine who had just gotten married, and she couldn't say husband. All she could say was, "Yeah, the guy I'm married to." That was what she could say. So it requires some conscious. You'll eventually get used to it.
How long did it take you to get used to calling Erica your wife?
That was actually easier. I honestly, as banal as it sounds, it's because wife is one syllable, whereas husband is two. But it was pretty. I thought it was really cool. I'd be like, wife. One of the things we occasionally go back and forth with is I don't know if you ever saw Priscilla, Queen of the Desert.
I did. Yeah, no. Megan said I could bring the Xbox if I wanted.
Well, I mean, this might be a generational thing. When I went on my honeymoon, we both did bring books. The joke that Eric and I always have is that the only difference between us when we're working and when we're on vacation is it's a different set of books we're reading.
Basically, I read an awesome book about the Athenian Navy, actually, which I highly commend to everyone, called Lords of the Sea. It talks about the Athenian Navy and sort of pegs it to the golden age of Athens, which is the appropriate thing to read while sitting in a hammock in Hawaii overlooking the ocean.
This is true. I'll tell you my book, this is like the geekiest conversation ever. I brought, because we went to Italy, and so I brought Bob Putnam's Making Democracy Work, which was all about the sort of why the northern provinces in Italy had better civil society than the southern provinces.
Oh, we really are like the nerdiest people on the planet, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not reading any books about the markets.
Okay, so I think we've now induced nausea among our commentators, but
if not to say stupor.
Yes, exactly. But this leads to an interesting segue, which is we also want to talk about the Dave Weigel business, and I believe many of the major players in this were all at your wedding.
Yes, I believe that. Well, the major player that we did, for those who don't know, Dave Weigel was a member of who is a friend and was at my wedding.
And the thing I kept thinking, it was the one moment where I actually thought, maybe there's something to this homosexual lifestyle, because I was walking into the TV room and they were all snuggled up, and looked like they were watching a really sweet movie. They were watching Aliens. Exactly. And I thought, you know what? That I get. That's something where, it's so nice that that's what they would think of as being the movie to cuddle and watch.
Well, I have to say that Peter is now sort of famous at his office because he apparently, I suggested he might want to bring the Xbox on the honeymoon in case it rained. And so he didn't.
You really suggested that?
I did. Well, I'd heard all these horror stories.
That wasn't a euphemism or anything. You actually meant Xbox.
No,
okay.
I actually suggested he might want to bring his video game console, just pack it and hook it up to the TV. I'd heard all these horror stories from people who were like, you think you want to go to an island and do nothing but stare into each other's eyes for 10 days. That is not true. Do not do it. By the end of the first week, you'll be at each other's throats, like planned activities. So I was like, hey, bring the Xbox. And I brought a video game that I bought for the honeymoon and for my Mac. And he bought a video game that he bought for the honeymoon, but apparently, the entire office was just realized that we were made for each other when he walked up to one of his colleagues and said, "Look what just arrived. It's my honeymoon video game." And she was like, "You're bringing a video game?" And he was like, "Hint."
There is a lovely scene there where one of these few straight characters in the movie explains how he got married to this Vietnamese hooker, and basically they show it in flashback, and the Vietnamese hooker says, "I'm your wife now," and so we occasionally say that to each other. "You're my wife," and she says, "I'm your wife."
Aww.
Yeah, it's very sweet.
Yeah, so far we've had my favorite husband remark has been Peter saw, I guess, a fake Steve Jobs account twittered confirming that the iPhone was coming to Verizon in 2011. So Peter very excitedly IM'd me this and then immediately realized it was a parody Twitter account. And so he said, "Pay no attention to me. I am nothing but a source of bad information. I am the Research 2000 of husbands."
Oh, that's a good one-liner.
Yes.
He's
so
a keeper of bacon.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to haunt him with that line basically for the rest of his natural-born life.
That is like if he ever publishes a book, I can see in the blurb, Megan McArdle. Oh, he's the Research 2000 of
absolutely. Right. I want to blurb his book.
Well, I will say, I thought of you actually because I was on vacation this week with some friends, including a gay couple that had just recently gotten married. And they were exceptionally sweet. They were still in the cuddle phase. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm Dan Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com. And you are?
I am Megan McArdle. I'm the business and economics editor of The Atlantic, and I blog at meganmcardle.theatlantic.com.
And also, congratulations. You got married last month.
I did. Not even last month, actually, just 17 days ago.
Well, it was last month because now we're in July.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Okay, so I stand corrected.
Married life speeds by like that. You can just get
well, apparently it mostly consists of going to Hawaii and lying on a beach. So I'm in the neighborhood. So that's true, right? It's just going to be like one long honeymoon?
Yeah, it'll be like that. Yes, absolutely. There's nothing but bliss in front of you. But that said, I feel bad because you invited me to your wedding, which was very kind of you. I couldn't make it, unfortunately, but I hear it was a lovely affair. The pictures looked fantastic, and of course, all I had to do was check my Twitter feed, and was getting constant updates about the reception. Yes,
there was one person who twittered, "I don't know anyone at this wedding, but I feel like I could do the seating chart." Because tables 6 and 7 were in the middle of a lengthy Twitter war during the reception.
And that's something everyone wants at their wedding, really.
Absolutely. I thought it was charming.